Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you and welcome, and thanks for getting through the technical difficulties we had to start today's webinar. I wanted to welcome you all to today's webinar, Mapping Places to Play, a look at the landscape of play in Philadelphia. My name is Castillo. I am the Senior Advisor for Learning and Evaluation at KABOOM. And I wanted to start today's webinar by thanking everyone again for joining us despite the technical difficulties, by thanking Vanguard for their financial support for this project, and a big note of thanks to Childcare Aware of America for doing a lot of the heavy analysis work and mapping work as part of this project. I think this partnership between these three organizations is a great look into what can be accomplished when everyone does some really fantastic work together. I'm going to start off today's webinar by doing some brief introductions of the people you're going to hear from today. First, myself, Isaac, as I introduced myself, the Senior Advisor for Learning and Evaluation at KABOOM. And we're going to have a great panel later on in today's presentation, which will include Lysa Ratliff, the Chief Executive Officer at KABOOM, Chinwe Onyekere, the Program Officer for Strong Start for Kids at Vanguard, and Sean Perkins, who's the Chief of Early Childhood Education for the City of Philadelphia. I'll give them more, all three of those individuals, a more detailed presentation and introduction later on. But first, I want to turn things over to Dr. Clare Waterman to allow her to introduce herself, and then we will start the content of today's webinar. So Clare, go ahead.
Thanks, Isaac. Hi, everyone. I'm Clare Waterman. I'm the Senior Director of Research for Childcare Aware of America. We are an organization that is a nonprofit focused on ensuring that all children and families have access to high quality childcare across the nation. And I had the pleasure of working with Isaac and his team at KABOOM on this mapping project. I definitely want to make sure to acknowledge my amazing mapping team, Alex Cooper and Jasmine Springfield, both of whom really were the mappers that got this project to where it is now, in collaboration with Isaac and his team. So thank you for having us here, and really excited to finally be at the point where we can present this work to everyone.
Thank you, Claire. And again, a big shout out to Alex and to Jasmine there at Childcare Aware of America for doing a lot of the heavy analysis work on this particular project. So I'm going to start us off by telling a little bit about my organization, KABOOM, and then we'll transition into this project itself, and then eventually to the panel. So KABOOM is the organization in the United States that's dedicated to ending place-based inequity for good. That is our mission, and that is what we're striving to do. Now, that's a big task, but KABOOM is up to it. Over our history, we have built and renovated nearly 17,000 play spaces throughout the United States, servicing almost 12 million kids, and have activated 1.5 million volunteers in our work and in the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis to improve the state of place-based inequity throughout the United States. Now, I'm going to quickly talk about the importance of play, because oftentimes people hear about it but don't really understand how important it is in the lives of a child. Play in itself is a developmental necessity. It supports pretty much every aspect of healthy growth for a child that they experience, particularly in their early years. And KABOOM's focus is to ensure that every kid in every community has a high quality place to play, learn, and thrive. And that's great, kind of big picture philosophically and intellectually, but the reality of the situation is that there are millions of kids in the United States that do not have access to a safe and accessible place to play. And there's a whole bunch of reasons that go into this, but really what the roots of this often is contributing to this is systemic racism and intentional historical disinvestment has led to the exclusion of children and their opportunities to be able to access safe places to play or high quality places to play. This concept is what we at KABOOM call place-based inequity. It's the difference between what a child should be experiencing in terms of accessibility to play and really what's going on currently throughout the United States. And so that is what KABOOM's role is in terms of trying to address or to decrease the amount of place-based inequity that's happening throughout the United States. As part of this project and our work in Philadelphia, KABOOM partnered with Vanguard and Childcare Aware of America to look specifically at what's going on in terms of place-based inequity in Philadelphia and Philadelphia's neighborhoods, and to really have a particular focus on one age range. And so with this project, we had two particular goals. The first is to understand the landscape of place-based inequity in Philadelphia for children ages 0 to 6 years old. So we're talking about that early learning, very critical part of life for children, right when they're born, up until the point where they're transitioning into kindergarten and first grade. And then in addition, as part of this work, we wanted to identify priority areas for investment for play spaces in Philadelphia using an equity-informed approach. So we know that there's a lot of need across the entire city of Philadelphia, but we wanted through this project to identify a smaller subset of neighborhood and communities where we can dedicate some very limited resources very quickly as part of this work and this project. So that is the project as a whole. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Waterman now to walk us through the methodology of what we did as part of this project.
Great, thanks, Isaac. So as Isaac said, I'm going to walk us through kind of what we did and how we did it, and then I'll pass it back over to Isaac to dig into kind of what our findings were. Next slide. So in order to map place-based inequity for the city of Philadelphia, we had to gather data from various different places. So we gathered publicly available information through, say, the census and OpenStreetMaps and others, as well as information on child care centers and family child care providers, their licensing information to understand kind of where they were located. One of the key things that we were including as part of this was where childcare providers were located in relation to the place spaces in order to kind of give that well-rounded understanding of what these experiences are for young children in the city. So what we did was we analyzed demographic data, locations, and other infrastructure and in the city, and we were able to kind of overlay different layers within that map to get a better understanding of how all of this kind of works together to provide more or less access to play spaces for children across the city. So one of the things that we did was we produced what we called our priority scores, and this was based on and expanded upon work that Isaac and his team have done in other places where we used multiple different variables to come up with a priority score first at the census tract level and then at the neighborhood and planning district level. Isaac, can you go to the next slide? So I don't expect everyone to read through every single thing here, but we used 3 different kind of buckets of variables to create these priority scores. So we used park access and built environment, population characteristics, and what we're considering kind of inequity indicators. So for example, for the park access, we actually did map the walking times and the average walking distance from childcare facilities to their nearest playground. So we included that. Number of schools, the percent area covered by parks, total number of childcare providers in the area. So we had a lot of these different variables that were part of this. And then population characteristics, the population of children under 18 per capita, potential childcare demand per capita, and then these inequity indicators, so life expectancy at birth, how many people in the household don't have internet subscription. So some of these other indicators that may suggest inequities are present. Next slide. Oh, okay. So as I mentioned, we had done the priority scores kind of at the census tract level to begin with. So this is important for several reasons. One is that this really allows, census tracts really are generally between 1,200 and 8,000 people. So it's a much smaller unit of measurement. And so we created these priority scores at that level. However, when we're thinking about making decisions, people rarely think of themselves in terms of kind of identifying with their census tract, right? That's not really something that is generally thought about. And so when we're thinking about making decisions and where we need to focus resources, oftentimes we're thinking about it at the neighborhood or even maybe the planning district level. So this slide gives you, and a big shout out to Lysa for these amazing slides, gives you a sense of how we kind of went from census tract level to kind of aggregating our priority scores up to the neighborhood level, and then that little bubble that shows you the planning district level. And next slide. One of the things that this map allowed us to do is really to think about, if you're looking at the maps, you can look and really home in on particular areas that you think need a focus. So if we're thinking about this priority area score, the darker, the higher the priority score. And so here we have, for example, Somerton. So when we zoom in, we can hover over, that's what this graphic is showing you. You can kind of hover over, you can see what the actual priority score was. You can see what the rates of on the different variables are. So we can see that this is a high priority area with high rates of minority languages being spoken, long walking distance from childcare centers to playgrounds, and high rates of children living in food deserts. And so this might be one place to focus and be thinking about not just place space and equity. That's the nice thing about this map, is actually it can be used for multiple different, a tool for multiple different decision points, which it was intentional on KABOOM's part when we were thinking about how we're actually going to create this this product. But one of the ways that we can kind of focus on here. Next slide. So I do want to just make sure to flag a few limitations to our approach. While we had a lot of really wonderful data and robust data available to us, one of the things that was not a data point available to us on a systematic level was the quality of the playgrounds that were that are included. And so while we did have playground locations across the city, we didn't have, how old each of those playgrounds were, or what quality, what kind of are they, what age groups they're necessarily for, or how, what quality they would be. So that's just a limitation. We did try to address that in doing a survey of childcare providers that asked about their place space access, and I'll talk a little bit about the results from that in a little bit, but we weren't able to do it systematically for the map. The locations and limitations of potential playground sites was also not included. So there could be plots of land for which they're not big enough, but that area might seem like an important area, or there could be other different physical characteristics that might limit the ability to put a playground site in one particular area. So that was something that we also did not take into account, partly because, again, the decision was made that we wanted to make sure that this was a resource that was valuable, not just for this project, but outside of this project as well for other decisions. And so we wanted to make sure that we were creating a resource that was really not so hyper focused that it couldn't have value outside of this project. It doesn't include real world considerations like permitting or other issues that create additional challenges. But I think that this is something, as Isaac will talk about some of the community collaboration and conversations that were happening, that really ultimately the map itself can't necessarily stand alone, right? And we recognize that when we're thinking about having conversations with folks in neighborhoods about what resources are needed here, where would a good place space be located? And so even though the map, this is a limitation of the map, it is really, the map often is just a kicking off point for conversations and for thinking about where could we put resources, but knowing that the people on the ground are really the ones who are going to give us that, final information on where it could be valuable. So I'm going to, with that, I think, pass it back over to Isaac to talk about our findings.
Yes, thank you, Claire. So we had three major findings that we wanted to share as part of this webinar and that are included in the report, and I'm going to walk through them really briefly. The first is that we found that nearly a third, or 31% of the census tracts in Philadelphia do not have a playground. And so this zoomed in view will show you where the playgrounds are that are mapped. And so it's going to zoom back out again and show you kind of generally the entire city of Philadelphia. There's a bunch of little dots where the playgrounds are, but then when we zoom in, we can see that there are indeed areas that don't even have a playground in them. And so residents would have difficulty accessing their play spaces. So about a third of the census tracts in Philadelphia do not have a playground. The second major finding is that we looked at the top 15 neighborhoods in Philadelphia that had the highest priority scores. So these are basically the top 10% in terms of need based on the calculations that we made for early learning place-based investments. So this 15 neighborhoods in orange are the ones that we found are the ones that have the highest place-based inequity or the greatest need among residents to access place spaces for that 0 to 6 age range. And so you're going to hear us talk a lot about these 15 particular neighborhoods going forward. The third major finding is that it doesn't just have to be playgrounds to help us address play space inequity in these neighborhoods. There are components or programming called playful learning installations throughout Philadelphia. And there's a great network of organizations that are partnering to do this work of playful learning installations, which are areas that children can play in that aren't necessarily as structurally formal as a traditional playground. And of the ones that exist in Philadelphia, 69% are in higher priority communities, and 13% are in the highest 15 neighborhoods that we have identified as the highest need for play space in investments going forward. So there's already things that are getting us started, but there's the recognition, particularly for those 15 highest need neighborhoods, that there's some work to be done. So that's quickly the 3 findings, and we're going to talk a little bit more throughout the webinar about those findings in those 15 neighborhoods. But I want to turn it back over to Claire to have a bit more discussion about how we got some additional data to inform the project.
Great, thank you, Isaac. So one of the things that we did, as I mentioned, we had a limitation, right, of really understanding what's the quality of the playgrounds. And so we were able to collaborate with the Early Learning Resource Center Region 18, which is the childcare resource and referral agency for Philadelphia, to put out a really brief survey of childcare providers in Philadelphia. And so we were pretty excited about this opportunity. It's a really quick, it was a jot form survey that got sent out. So it was really just meant to get quick information back. We got 125 respondents. That does represent a low response rate, but it does represent over 100 respondents. And so we were pretty happy with that, especially given that, you know, there's a lot of survey fatigue of childcare providers right now, as well as others. What we did find, and I think this is really important and speaks a bit to the quality, is that 44% of respondents reported that the immediate surroundings near their local playgrounds were unsafe. So it might be, a playground might be within what they consider an unsafe park, or the neighborhood where the playground is located is considered unsafe. And then over 42% also said that the walking journey to and from the playground did not feel safe, right? So when we're thinking about how many of these providers are actually would get to a play space that would be in their neighborhood, walking would be the key way to get there. And oftentimes that walking journey was not felt to be safe. A third of respondents listed that actually the distance was just too far, right? So that would be a barrier, that getting from their location to a play space that was appropriate for their children, just even the distance, right? Imagine walking with a handful of toddlers, right? That's not going to be very easy, especially if it's more than a quarter mile away, or maybe even less. And there was a theme of inadequate playground quality as well. So a third of respondents said that the playground equipment was just too old. And then a quarter of respondents said it was unsafe or not age appropriate, right? So you may have play spaces that are geared towards 5 to 12-year-olds, which our toddlers are not going to be able to access. And sometimes even our 5-year-olds, right? Sometimes that play equipment is quite difficult. And so these were some of the interesting findings that we found. Something just to also note, which was not based on the survey data, but which based on the quantitative data that we have, was that only 50% of licensed providers in Philly are located within a quarter mile of an outdoor play space. So when we're thinking again about what does it take to take a handful of kids and get them all ready, have the staff, right? You know, you need to make sure you have enough staff to get there, that these are real barriers that that folks have to accessing childcare, play spaces for childcare providers. I'll pass it back over to Isaac.
Thank you, Claire. So we did the quantitative analysis with the mapping work, and then we surveyed the early childcare providers that Claire just talked to you about. And we took that information, and that was kind of our initial set of findings. And then in addition, we partnered with a local Philadelphia-based consultant to interview more than 25 representatives from 11 of the higher priority neighborhoods. And we shared these initial group of findings with residents and sought feedback on them. And the residents we interviewed were all overwhelmingly supportive and validated the map and the work that we've done to talk about the need for place-based investment in their communities. They looked at the results. They said that they were accurate. They shared some additional insights that we kind of incorporated into our reporting. And they also identified several additional challenges, which I would like to share with you now, that we need to think about in addition to or on top of the prioritization work that we did. The first of these additional pieces of feedback that the residents shared were that there was a desire to improve their communities and their neighborhoods' assets, but it needs to be balanced against a lot of gentrification concerns. So you have a quote from a resident here that, there's the appreciation for wanting to make things better, but also kind of the skepticism of what's driving it and what's going to happen in terms of gentrification of their neighborhood. A second thing that we heard is that residents were able to identify barriers to play that traditional analyses or the mapping and the data analysis work would never be able to quantify or even identify, right? So these residents live in these communities, they know what the walks are like to these playgrounds or what's going on with these playgrounds, and they're the ones who can and should be providing valuable insight as to what is really happening and what additional things are going to be needed in these communities over and above just building a new playground. So that was an important piece of knowledge that we also heard from residents and we want to share as part of this report. A third thing we heard from residents is that there are varying levels of community involvement across each neighborhood, which may complicate the work going forward. So while some residents have heavily engaged residents that are willing to do a lot of things, there are other communities that don't have the time or the resources to devote to being doing a lot of the work or leadership around some of these issues. And that's going to complicate how we think of things going forward, because we can't just default to the loudest voices. We have to take in consideration that there's some residents or community members who just don't have the capabilities to be supportive of this work. And we need to take some additional steps to make sure that we get what we need to get when doing some place-based investments in all of these prioritized communities. And the final thing that we heard is that there was another confirmation for us, and this won't be surprising, is that different people call different neighborhoods different things. And there are even different borders that are commonly, informally, and informally accepted for each neighborhood. So as part of this discussion going forward, there has to be a lot of clarity and discussion and sense making about what people mean by their neighborhoods and what the boundaries are for those neighborhoods as we do deeper dives into considering where we're going to invest and how we're going to invest, because a lot of people have a lot of different terms and boundary definitions for each of these communities and neighborhoods. And we just need to get some better clarity as to what neighborhoods or what areas people are talking about when we have these conversations. So we want to share those larger findings as well as part of the study. Claire, I'm going to invite you back to talk about the next thing.
Great. And I think one of the things we wanted to really highlight as part of this is how this, the project can really is really kind of a model for how we can use data-driven initiatives to kind of really push for better outcomes for kids, right? And so from our perspective, what we are the way that we approach this work is that more data-driven efforts can help to reduce inequities, right? So, and when we're thinking about data-driven, we're not just saying like the data tells us what to do. It's that, efforts are really, the data can provide us with objective and even sometimes subjective information about how we can make, and that can help us make decisions about what we do. And we really think that one of the important pieces to lift up here is that was part of this project was really that collaboration between organizations, systems, and partners to help reduce place-based inequity for this project, but all other inequities for others, right? And I think one of the things that we really thought was wonderful about this project was that we were able to leverage the, what each of our organizations brought to the table, right? So we have that knowledge of early learning spaces and early childhood and childcare, and mapping. Our mapping team is fantastic. I love them so much. As well as really, KABOOM has just such an amazing breadth of knowledge around place spaces, and then the community members really have this amazing knowledge around kind of what do we need, right? I mean, I think that so often people come in from the outside without really truly engaging internal folks, and that was really important to us. Really, these can help equitably distribute or direct resources and investments. And we really think that that's a value here. And also encourage policymakers, city leaders, planners, and change makers. We really want them to use this map, right? You've heard me say several times, it was really important to us that this map wasn't just for one particular project, but that it could be used as a resource outside, because the priority scores, the maps themselves, they have other information that can inform other investments as well. And really thinking about focusing on these priority neighborhoods and coordinating efforts for perhaps other things that could lift up the neighborhoods and better serve the folks living there. And I'll pass it over to you, Isaac, to wrap up. And I know people are probably really excited to talk to our panel, because I know we have a great panel with us.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. So where does this leave us? It's important to recognize that this analysis, as Claire mentioned, is just the first step in this work, right? It's in Philadelphia. This means that we want to work with partners throughout the city to focus on those identified 15 priority neighborhoods for additional place-based investment. It includes working with city agencies like the Office of Children and Families, funders such as Vanguard, early child care providers, and local nonprofits. New opportunities for play should include consideration of traditional playground builds as well as playful learning installations so that kids can play in non-traditional areas. And so this is really what we're hoping to be the first step in a lot of consistent multi-year work in the city of Philadelphia to address place-based inequity. At a larger level, we hope that this study and our work encourages more data-informed work in Philadelphia and in other cities. There's a lot that we currently can say about place-based inequity, but there's still a lot of opportunities and a lot of things we do not know. And we hope that additional data collection and analyses similar to this is going to inform more equitable decision-making throughout Philadelphia, but also throughout the country as well. In the spirit of helping Philadelphia youth gain access to more places to live, learn, and play, I want to then turn this conversation over to our panelists to talk about where we're going to go with this information and kind of the next steps in their own work. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see our panelists a little bit better and invite our panelists to kind of join the discussion. And I'm going to start, as we're transitioning, to doing really quick introductions with our panelists. I'll start with Lysa Ratliff, the CEO of KABOOM. She was the Vice President of Partnership Development at KABOOM and has held senior leadership roles at Habitat for Humanity International, Save the Children, and has spent more than a decade in international marketing communications at several large corporations. So thank you, Lysa. Chinwe has over 20 years of expertise advancing equity and leveraging philanthropic investments as the program officer for Strong Start for Kids at Vanguard. Chinwe oversees 2 program portfolios, Effective Programs and Connected Communities. And she's also the co-founder and president emerita of Together for West Philadelphia, an organization which aims to facilitate collaboration within West Philadelphia among community, public, and private sector stakeholders to foster shared projects in order to maximize impact in the areas of health, education, food access, and opportunity. So welcome, Chinwe. And Sean is the Chief of Early Childhood Education with the City of Philadelphia, where he is responsible for setting the vision and executing the strategic development of a unified system of early childhood education in Philadelphia. Previously, Sean was Executive Director of Education Initiatives for New Orleans Public Schools, where he led the city's efforts on early childhood education, career and post-secondary preparedness, and students involved in court-involved secure care. So thank you and welcome, Sean. And in the interest of time, I'm going to dive right into a couple of questions. Lysa, I'm going to start with a question for you really quickly. And so you heard the study, you're familiar with the findings. You're hearing that a third of the census tracts in Philadelphia don't have access to a playground or a safe place to play. What does that mean for the children of Philadelphia and what's at stake for communities in Philadelphia?
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. Thanks, everyone. Such an important conversation to have. Those are some of the things I wrote down, Isaac. You know, a third don't have a playground. 44% of the childcare providers found the spaces around them unsafe, a third too far or too old. And what really resonated with me is we're talking about our kids. You know, this is a lot of data and a lot of maps and a lot of information, but at the end of the day, we are talking about the health and well-being of our kids, which our collective future is wrapped up in. And if you think about all of the things that happen in childhood, especially when we're talking about the 0 to 6 age, most of your brain development is happening. You're learning how to navigate the world. You're learning how to get the tools to even deal with future trauma. Everything, like literally, childhood is the blueprint of who we become. And our kids are the future leaders that we're going to count on to take care of us. And so you ask a person like me, kind of what's at stake, everything's at stake. We've got big problems to solve. And if we don't prioritize and think about how we can fix the problems for our kids, then quite frankly, there's no hope for our future. And so I think everything's at stake. Another thing I'll mention, Claire pointed to is, I think, this is a solvable problem, and having the tools to collectively come together and solve a problem like this helps us solve other problems. And so all this data that you've presented really just gives us the roadmap of what to do. We can't do it alone, but it gives us the roadmap of what to do, which really teaches us how do we solve big problems that we've inherited that we can't solve alone, in creative ways that is really moving the needle on something. So both kind of thinking about how urgent it is to pay attention to everything that needs to happen to have a healthy childhood, and to how do we start to solve problems in a different way. I think both of those things are on the line for our collective future.
Thank you, Lysa. So Chinwe, given everything that's at stake and kind of your position as a funder in the Philadelphia community at Vanguard, tell me a little bit about how this study is going to inform your work personally and the work of Vanguard, and potentially how it can inform other funders' work as well.
Thanks, Isaac. And hi, everyone. It's really such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And thanks for that question. It's been a real honor and privilege for us at Vanguard and Strong Start for Kids to have the opportunity to support this work. And I think, the word that really comes to mind is that the data and the mapping that you and Dr. Waterman created is really directional for funders and for the funding community. It provides, the foundation and the framing for where we can align our dollars in coordination with other funders, private funders, but also with state and local funding as well, to pinpoint areas of greatest need. And I think that where we can have really large and significant impact. And I think that aligns with the vision and mission for Strong Start for Kids, which was, developed by Vanguard almost 7 years ago, to a 10-year commitment to really look at that pivotal age of 0 to 5, where we know can set the foundation for long-term impact in their lives and in the lives of their families. And so looking at that whole ecosystem, the community ecosystem and family ecosystem, is really something that we're really excited about and committed to. And so when you talked about the bringing community in as a partner in looking at the data and basically testing and validating what you saw to make sure that really resonated with community is core to the work that we're doing. So I think it has an opportunity to really inform our future decision making and allow us to work in consultation with each other in those important 15 areas that were identified.
Thank you, Chinwe. So Sean, as the person who's kind of overseeing a lot of the work for 0 to 6-year-olds in the city of Philadelphia and a representative of the city government here, talk to me a little about how all of this is going to inform your work going forward. And in particular, I'd be curious to hear about how you're going to talk about it with other representatives throughout city government, because this is a big thing that we can't tackle, a single city agency can't tackle on their own. So I'm hearing a little bit more about how you're going to encourage other city agencies and city employees to utilize this information.
Yeah, that's a great question, Isaac, and very proud to live and work in a city and to raise 2 children, one of whom is 3, the other one is 7 years old, in a city that is valuing children and families, because we know birth rates across our country, especially in metropolitan regions, are decreasing at a very staggering rate. We live in a city in Philadelphia that isn't. It's doubling down on those investments to say that actually we need to make sure that we are supporting our families and our youngest soon-to-be leaders. It is community and collaboration. It's exactly like you mentioned. It's across different funding streams. It's across different organizations, and that's hard, right? That takes time, that takes energy, but those are resources that we need to utilize and maximize to our highest potential for our youngest generations. It's been so important across the city that we have private investments in just hiring somebody on our team that's a playful learning fellow, Dr. Rachel Tadaro. I encourage people to go look her up. Like, that's an incredible investment to hire somebody out of Temple University who like has a PhD in this specialty field to help drive decision making and to be more informative across all of our different organizations, both in the city and in the private space. So this panel is testament to some of that prioritization and investment.
Thank you, Sean. Chinwe, I want to come back to you and get your impressions of another finding that we didn't mention in this report, and that is part of the larger report, but I want to share that with the group right now and get your reaction to it. And that's one of the findings that only 50% of early childhood education providers in the city of Philadelphia had a playground within a quarter mile of their location. What do you think about that, and how does that affect like the thinking and even the ability for early childhood providers to be able to provide a holistic level of education for kids?
Isaac, thank you for that. It's a really powerful finding, and I think it really reflects the, what you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that play inequity is representative of systemic racism and disinvestment in communities. And I think we know that many of our incredible early childhood providers are in communities across Philadelphia that have systemically been disinvested in, and that's something that we're trying to address and rectify and acknowledge and speak to and name. And so I think having 50% of folks that are committed to our youngest, most incredible people of our communities, 0 to 5, have that barrier for play and knowing how important it is in the developmental necessity across all of the years is something that is a huge barrier and that we need to address head on. So I think that you cannot disentangle the systemic racism from the work that's happening and from what we are seeing in the data. I bet if you overlaid redlining to the map that you had, you would see probably a one-on-one comparison. And so I think we need to lift that up and think about, it's not going to be 5 years to rectify something that happened over 150, 50 years of issues. So we have to take the long view and think of it long-term capital and investment in our communities, and that we have to do it in partnership. No one sector can solve it alone, but we need to do it together, and it needs to be led and driven by community. So I think that is something that it brings up when hearing that we need to take a holistic approach to problem solving in this space, and that we need to have long-term investment and committed community investment and driven through the lens and the approach from community.
Thank you, Chinwe. So Lysa, KABOOM has been doing this work for a long time and been doing it over, multiple different cities. And so here we have the opportunity to do some additional work in Philadelphia. I'm curious as to what advice or guidance you would have for people in Philadelphia that want to push forward with this work, particularly given that some of these are really difficult conversations, right? Like sometimes people don't want to talk about systemic racism and historical disinvestment. Sometimes there are people that are just going to put up walls to this. Like, what does success look like, or what needs to happen, or what advice can you give to the people in Philadelphia to try to make a difference in addressing place-based inequity in the community?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to build off what Chinwe was saying, because she was singing my heart song. I think one, historical and racialized disinvestment is not our fault. it's our problem to solve. And so having these honest conversations that acknowledge that this is the truth, kind of this is what we have inherited, and this is what we need to lean into for problem solving, is not a personal attack on anyone. You know, and I think a big part of it is why we're using data to inform what needs to get done. And Chinwe, whatever map we do across the country, it overlays with the redlining maps. So, you know, it's a fact, let's acknowledge it. And I think that there's a couple of things. One, you know, KABOOM came into a community of leaders that were already doing so much work across Philadelphia. And though there was work happening collectively, there was also work happening separately. And so having a group of leaders that recognize that we need to figure out how to solve problems in a different way by utilizing this data and getting the discipline and alignment necessary to kind of tackle it together, because we can't solve it alone, is like one of the first and most necessary ingredients. And so where, you know, kind of we're working with Vanguard and Childcare Aware, and even with William Penn, there's a community of dozens of leaders who are doing this work. And so recognizing that we have to collaborate, we have to have conversations like this, we have to share information and not try to own the solution to the problem ourselves. The other thing I'll say is that we also have to recognize that this is urgent. This goes back to what I was saying before your other question, Isaac, is that there's a lot at stake here. You know, we're not just talking about playgrounds and our kids having joy and fun, which would be enough that our kids deserve joy and to have a childhood full of play. We're talking about what happens when they don't, and versus what happens when they do, and how our collective future is wrapped up in that. And so recognizing that this is an urgent problem, but it is also solvable. So using data like this to tell us and inform where we go makes this an easy to solve problem. The challenge is when we don't come together like this, you know, we work in opposite directions. And when people think that it is someone else's problem to solve, we've got to pool our resources, because we can only move at the pace the resources allow. So we know exactly what to do, especially with the 0 to 6 range right now. But it can't, you know, people can't expect that the city is going to do it on their own, or a big funder is going to step in and fund all the problem. It has to be collective effort. And that's where, you know, we can really start making a dent, and then paying attention to what happens because we did it. Now we can start to celebrate and look at the magical kind of outcomes for kids and communities, because they were participating, because we were putting interventions in place that would make a difference in their life. We can move on and start thinking about that.
Thank you, Lysa. So Sean, I have one last question for you before we close out the webinar. And that's for the office that you oversee. What are the next steps you're going to take to help solve this problem? And then like, where do you need help? I mean, you have like residents on the call, you have funders, you have a whole bunch of people listening in. Like, how do you, Sean, and your office need help from everyone else on this call to help solve this problem?
Yeah, the first part I'd say is one of the hardest things to give, which is trust. But like, trust is really hard to get, especially when you have been disenfranchised and you have been historically and culturally marginalized across every spectrum you can in our country and in our different communities' histories. So to look at this panel, myself included, and be like, yeah, I'm going to trust these folks, that is really hard to ask. And if you can't, I'd say give your voice. I think that's the next most important thing, is to say, speak up, right? We're already seeing it in the chat and some questions that are coming in about like, hey, what about my community? You forgot about this community. That's great. Let's start looking in, zoom the magnifying glass in a little bit more. So I think for the residents and the constituents and those who are responsible for children's lives, it would be to speak up, have some trust as well. But also think about how you can help maintain. I think that's a really critical aspect of this, is that some places were built and then they just weren't maintained. And that's because a lot of different reasons, honestly. Safety is probably the biggest one across Philadelphia right now. So I'd say there's a lot of work that's happening, but to be involved, be trusting, and also lend your voice, probably the biggest ones. For the investors, open the pocketbooks. I think that's important as well, because once you get the trust of those, and for those who are going to want to maintain and be participants in their society, in their communities, then I think a lot of beautiful things can happen. Like it was Tupac Shakur that said that we could have the rose grow out of the cement. And I think we can see some of that happen in many of our communities. But just imagine about the fields of roses that we can start planting.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, Lysa and Chinwe and Sean, and to Clare as well, and the people at Childcare Aware of America for the work that you did as part of this project, and to Vanguard as well for funding and supporting this work. Before we close out for today's webinar, I did want to have people have access to the full report, which you will be able to find at this bit.ly address, Philly Play Map, or you can scan the QR code and it'll hopefully be in the chat here shortly, where you can see the full story map and all of the maps and all the information with all the details that you could possibly want about our findings and the work that we did. I highly encourage each and every one of you to just engage with this, to take a look at it. There's a lot of information there, but hopefully it's going to give you a good understanding of where to start these conversations, because we did discuss earlier that all of us on this call and on the panel believe that this is only a starting point for the conversation. It's not the end point. And we want and encourage people to engage with this information, to talk about it, and to use it to inform your work going forward. Because to Lisa's point, we have a lot at stake here. And the more we can utilize information like this and use it as a stepping stone to create change, the better off kids in Philadelphia are going to be. We just have to take the initiative and not get frustrated, not get overwhelmed, but sit with this and to echo what Sean said, lift up your voice to advocate for children who often can't advocate for themselves. So thank you, each and every one of you again for struggling through our technical difficulties as well. Please check out this information. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Childcare Aware of America and Vanguard for supporting this work. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Isaac.